Hello, my name is Gene Jones. I'm with the Southern Waste Information Exchange. We're conducting the PFAS Forum in Tampa, Florida next week. We wanted to present to you an early presentation focusing on research that's being conducted for PFAS remediation. Today, we have Dr. Bruce Locke. Bruce is the department chair for the Department of Chemical and Biomedical Engineering at the FAMU-FSU College of Engineering. And Bruce is going to be presenting his research related to gas liquid water plasma reactors for PFAS degradation. So Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you tell us what's going on in the world of research. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Gene. Very happy to be able to talk to the group today about our work. First, I'd like to acknowledge all my collaborators and students who've been working with me. Rachel Gallen, Radu Belusu, Karam Esso, Dr. Robert Wandel. Dr. Yonang Tang is a civil environmental engineering professor we've been working with for several years. And the work that I'm going to talk about, we call it a gas liquid plasma reactor for PFAS degradation. But I'd like to give a little bit of introduction and background about what we're doing before we get to the data on the PFAS itself. So some of the background work I'm going to talk about has been supported for several years now by the National Science Foundation. And we had some collaboration with the Czech Institute of Plasma Physics. And we're currently working with Geosyntec, Red Hill Scientific, and FSU under a research agreement. And we also have current funding with the Hinckley Center for Solid and Hazardous Waste Management. So first of all, I'm going to give a little bit of science in the background. What is a plasma? Well, when we talk about plasma, there are key factors here. And this is kind of a schematic diagram showing the key properties of a plasma, which involve temperature and density of electrons. So when you make a plasma, you create electrons. And you can see plasma as one of the major components of the universe. But where we are interested in is the kind of process called a non-thermal plasma, which is like, if you can see this diagram, you can see where neon lights are. You can see where lightning is. You can see where torches are, arc welding. These are all kind of plasma processes that have very high temperature. But what we're talking about is what we call a non-thermal plasma that has a lower background temperature, but the energy of the electron is still high enough to cause useful chemical reactions. You can see how it fits in to the plasma universe. The number of ions that are in the air, for example, in clean air, and the temperature, the normal ambient temperature. So we're just above this range of the normal ambient temperature, but we're also having a higher electron density, the amount of electrons to cause the reactions we're interested in. So just kind of an idea of how you make a plasma. You can use ionizing radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, charged particles, electron beams. You can also use electric discharge, and that's perhaps the easiest way, and that's what we spend our time on. And with an electric discharge, you can use a variety of different kinds of AC or DC, direct current, alternating current, or radio frequency, microwave. But we're interested mostly in what we call pulsed discharge, which is a pulse. You create a pulse and it injects that pulse of energy into a system. So one might ask, well, why do we want to do this, and why would we contact the plasma with water? And so here's an example from the natural world where lightning, what happens when lightning strikes occur over water. For many years, we've been studying these interactions of plasma with liquid water, and we've created many kinds of reactors to do this and studied their application, a lot of it for pollution control, water treatment. The first level of work was where we actually made the plasma inside the water. And then the next level of work here is where the plasma is formed over the water. And for example, inside bubbles or just directly over the water, or in the one we will spend more time talking about is this kind of reactor configuration where a plasma is formed on a film between a gas and a liquid. And so we'll also say a little bit more about scaling up the reactor and how it's used at the end. So again, in terms of contacting a plasma, this ionized gas with a liquid water, why do you want to do it? What are the applications? Well, water pollution is one important one where basically we're creating oxidants and reductants that can degrade a wide range of organic and even convert some inorganic compounds to other species that can be that can be removed. It also can be used to treat the air itself. So if you have an air flowing, almost like a scrubber, where you have the air flowing and there's a reaction occurring at the interface, so contaminants from the air can be destroyed and products collected in the liquid. That's been used for volatile organic compounds, as well as things like nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. They also used some of the compounds that are formed here, these radicals and even the stable species like peroxides can be used as disinfectants and have applications in biomedicine. There's a very growing field of using plasma in medical processes, not just for disinfection, now that's a big area, but also for other kinds of biomedical applications. And as a chemical synthesis, as a process to produce things from other raw materials, these reactions are also very useful. There's a lot of reviews on this subject. I'm not going to go in more detail about it, but just to give you a flavor for where it occurs. Now, this slide is fairly complicated, but I want to emphasize just a couple of key points. So if you have a plasma here and you have a liquid here, there's an interfacial region between the plasma and the liquid. Now, depending upon what the gas composition is, you produce a variety of different species in the gas. And here's just some of them: the OH radical, atomic oxygen, hydrogen. And in the case of air, you might also produce some of these nitrogen containing species as well. There's a whole variety of other processes that occur, including evaporation, electrolysis, ions formed, and these species generally come and react at this interface, where some penetrate deeply into the liquid. But the key point here is that the chemistry is strongly dependent upon the gas composition, and not all of these factors shown in this slide are important in every process. So what we're interested in is the key species that are important in chemical degradation of contaminants, and PFAS being one. But of course, as many of you already know, the OH radical is a key component in every one of the advanced oxidation methods where you talk about ozone or hydrogen peroxide or UV light. OH radical is one of the key reactive species because it has a very high oxidation potential. Ozone, of course, itself is important in terms of reactions. And in some configurations of our system or of plasma, gas, liquid, ozone can be important, although often actually ozone itself is not as important as the OH radical directly. H2O2, hydrogen peroxide, is important. Of course, some of the applications I mentioned as a disinfectant, but chemically it also leads to one of the advanced oxidation methods that combine UV, H2O2, ozone, H2O2. So H2O2 itself is very important. In terms of potential reducing species, hydrogen radicals are formed, and one species called aqueous or hydrated electron is a strong reducing species. And we have evidence, and I'll say a little bit at the end about that, because that's important for things like chlorinated organics and even perhaps in the PFAS, the reductive pathways. I'll just say a little bit, just as in background in terms of these processes. So you can see in this slide, it just shows reaction rate constants, which is a measure of how fast the reaction occurs. For example, an OH radical with various compounds, organic compounds, for example, benzene, phenol, chlorophenol. And you can see these high rates of reaction are very close to the upper limit, to actually what's called the fusion limit. And OH radical reacts very, very fast. You can also see that the hydrated electron or aqueous electron can react very fast in some compounds, like, for example, chlorinated species. And it can also react, chlorinated species can also react with hydrogen radical itself at high rates. Ozone reactions are typically less, and they're also can be strongly pH dependent, but typically ozone concentration can be much higher than the OH radical. And so in comparing the actual rate, you have to factor in the concentration of the species themselves. And so one could make an estimate, and based upon the relative concentration of ozone to OH radical, you can estimate whether the ozone pathways are important compared to OH radical. And that would depend upon a compound here. So ideally in a plasma, just as a very simple idea, it leads to the dissociation of water, and the water creates the OH and the H. Now, what we want to do is take that OH and react with the organic as quickly as possible. But in some cases, the other reactions, for example, to make H2O2 or even H2, can take away from this reaction, and it allows us to produce these more stable species like H2O2 itself, which can be used later in the process or outside of the reactor itself. So we can also, one of the limiting factors in designing our reactors to reduce these back reactions. So when you make OH radical, you don't want it to go back to water. So this is a key component in terms of how fast the reaction is with the OH radical. So our system, as I mentioned in kind of the configuration, there are different ways of designing the contact where the plasma touches the water. And over the years, we designed a whole variety of reactors. One type is where the plasma just forms a layer along the surface of a large liquid. Another is where the plasma forms inside of a bubble itself. And a third is where we have a gas-liquid flow. We create a film, a liquid film at the interface between the gas and the liquid, and the plasma moves along that interface. And that's what we'll be focusing on mostly. This is a continuous reactor as opposed to the batch systems that are given here. And this reactor allows us to do a much more detailed analysis of the reactions that are occurring and the properties of the plasma itself. So the results that I will talk about are utilizing a system where we pump in a liquid, water, containing a contaminant, for example. We have a gas flow, and this flows through a small reactor which we can characterize by different techniques. Emission spectra, it's kind of like analyzing the spectrum of the sun. You look at the peaks that are formed and you can get the properties, the temperatures, the densities, and those things. We have it connected to a power supply. This is just one example. In this particular case, it's a commercial power supply that delivers a very short nanosecond scale pulse, and we can produce lots of pulses, and that allows us to perform the chemistry. And in our system, we take out the samples that come out, we measure them with various techniques for the liquid phase, and we can also measure gas phase contaminants components by gas phase sampling, FTIR or GCMS. Sometimes in the past, we've also done a lot of work with NMR. So this just shows the pictures of the reactor in its operation. This is the reactor cell. This case is a quartz cell, so it allows us to take measurements inside. We also have in this case, the gas liquid mixture is flowing from top to bottom. And you can see how the film is formed along the walls and the interfacial dynamics between the gas and the liquid. The plasma channel is propagating. Every single pulse leads to one single plasma channel. However, when we look at an integrated over time plot picture where we have a long shutter speed, you can see how the plasma channels fill up the surface between the gas and the liquid, and how a single channel looks. So not to belabor too much, but we have spent a lot of time analyzing this reactor, so we have a pretty good understanding of the volumes, the gas liquid interface, the time scale for the gas and the liquid inside the reactor. The way this is designed is a very short gas phase, 2 to 5 millisecond residence time of the gas. And so the contact is very quick. The liquid phase a little bit longer because of the design, and that depends upon the nozzles that we're using. We also characterize the hydrodynamics, and the flow pattern is defined as what's called annular flow, but that's basically the picture I showed before, where you have this annular central region where the gas is flowing with that film along the walls. We also have analyzed the mass and energy transport between the gas and the liquid and the plasma itself. The electrical characterizations are important. I won't go into a lot. This kind of study requires interdisciplinary work from electrical engineering, chemical engineering, hydrodynamic analysis. There's quite a range of things. And I won't go into the details of how we analyze the plasma, but these are just some of the typical properties that we determine in terms of our spectra. And we also look at the characterizing the reactors. I just wanted to mention that the plasma power supplies are under development, and we have two that we're using. One is a custom made for us, and another is a commercial unit. And you can just see that as the voltage pulses are of order, this is a nanosecond scale. It's a little bit longer rise, but the current pulse is of order here about 20 nanoseconds. And this is the amount of power for every individual pulse that's delivered. Similar characteristics in the case of the Eagle Harbor. And I just want to mention that that's very important in the applications we talk about, particularly in PFAS, where you can have a very salty solution, briny solution. And those characteristics of the narrow nanosecond pulse, it's very important for allowing us to operate at high conductivity of solution. We do have a homemade power supply that a visiting professor from Romania built for us, and it has fairly cheap, but it has very similar characteristics, although it does have some drawbacks in terms of operation at high conductivity. And so the first result I just want to emphasize here is conductivity effect. And because I know from a practical point of view, salt solutions can be very important, particularly in leachate from groundwater and such. But this plot shows the electron density, which is a measure of our plasma ability to react as a function of liquid conductivity. Now, what's important here is that the plasma itself is relatively unaffected by liquid conductivity almost to seawater level. So this is up to almost 40 millisiemens per centimeter, which is very close to seawater. And that is independent for argon as a carrier and helium as a carrier. So that's one very important characteristic of the nanosecond pulse. And that's something that's not available in previous work. We have analyzed, I'm not going to go into all the details, I'm going to look at some results from a couple of these specific examples. But this reactor we've characterized in terms of the OH radical, quantified the OH radical that's produced, and compare it to other advanced oxidation methods by using chemical probes. And we also have measured, of course, the hydrogen peroxide generation itself and the effect of the solution properties on that. We've done a lot of work on hydrocarbon oxidation, and that's of relevance. Of course, if you had a hydrocarbon contaminant, in that case, we also are interested in taking hydrocarbon streams and oxidizing them from normal alkanes into alcohols, aldehydes, and such. But that also leads to an important application that Dr. Tang and his graduate student at the time, Dr. Young, in terms of 1,4-dioxane oxidation. So in that study, we combined the plasma reactor for the initial oxidation and a subsequent bioreactor for the final degradation of biodegradable products. I'll say a little bit about that one. And I won't talk about the nitrogen oxide work, but that's actually where we're commercially developing our reactor right now in terms of developing the reactor for farming applications. And I will talk about the perfluoro octanoic acid studies we're doing. So just as a point of comparison, this is a measure. The units are maybe not familiar to you, but it's basically a measure of amount per unit of energy. And so in the thermodynamic limit, the best one could do in terms of making OH radical would be this number 20 molecules per 100 electron volts. So that's the limit, the thermodynamic limit. UV light in and of itself can create OH radical by this reaction, just a UV light interaction. Of course, it depends on the wavelength and the yields of the lamps, but the numbers given for direct in water, inside water, and in gas vapor are given here, 2 to 3 and 5 to 6 molecules per 100 electron volts. The radiation processes, and there are some commercialized radiation process for water treatment that use electron beams, gamma radiation. And you can see the yield of OH radical in the range 2 to 4, 7 to 9, a little bit higher in the gas phase than UV light alone. And the plasma also can have direct electron collisions with water. The electrons are not at the high energy as you have in a radiation process, but they are sufficient to create OH radical. And based upon our data, the yield of OH radical are very comparable to both, of course, direct UV light and to radiation chemistry. I put in as a note here, this is the plasma over the water, and so it's also the plasma contacting water, but plasma underwater is not so efficient. Advanced oxidation methods encompass all of these processes from ozone UV, hydrogen peroxide, etc. And you can estimate their OH radical production in the similar range of 2 to 8. So I did want to mention this example on 1,4-dioxane. And what we're doing here, 1,4-dioxane is a contaminant in groundwater, and it's very water soluble. And it also is fairly hard to degrade biologically. And so what we're doing in the plasma reactor, we're flowing through the plasma reactor with a very short residence time, and it's able to do the initial step, which is to create biodegradable organic acids and other compounds that can then be fed to a bioreactor, and where the final mineralization occurs. And that saves significant energy, because it does take energy to make the plasma, but we don't want to use that plasma to take the 1,4-dioxane all the way to mineralized products. So this just shows a little of that data where we look at the hydraulic retention time in the plasma itself. And you can run the reactor long enough and degrade all the 1,4-dioxane, or you can run it to partially degrade the 1,4-dioxane into intermediates, and these intermediates are then degraded subsequently in the bioreactor. So I'm summarizing here our data on PFOA that has been published, and also in comparison to some of the other literature that's out there. There are other plasma processes that are being intensively studied for degrading PFOA, and particularly using this is a little bit different plasma process. The group of Stratton et al. Here. There's also a group in Japan, Yasuoka, using a little bit different type of plasma process, and then our process. So this is in our early work, we didn't have the capability in our own lab to analyze the PFOA itself. So we were measuring fluoride as an indicator of the partial mineralization of the parent compound. And so these comparisons are based upon fluoride production. And so the energy yield, which is a measure of amount, moles per energy, is given here, moles per joule. And what I'm just showing here is that in terms of energy yield, moles per joule, the efficiency of our plasma nanosecond pulsar is significantly higher than others that were reported in the literature. Now, I did want to mention not only the idea about oxidation, but reduction. And reduction processes utilize this hydrated aqueous electron. And so I'm showing here this is unpublished data, this is preliminary work, but showing the production of hydrated electron based upon measurements of chloroacetate conversion into chloride. If it was reacting with hydrogen, it would produce molecular hydrogen. And so by measuring chloride, we can get an estimate directly of the aqueous electron, the hydrated electron. And so we use two different methods for this, and we're able to show that the moles per 100 electron volt, the amount of hydrated electron produced by the plasma is it's more efficient than what's found in the case of ultrasound, but less than what's actually made by electron beams. So the PFOA, though, in the reactor where we looked at, the PFOA is at the interface between the gas and the liquid. It's a surfactant. And so it can be attacked directly from the gas as well as by reactants that get into the liquid. And so by putting in compounds that suppress reactions from the gas or liquid, we try to tease out where the reaction is occurring. And so what we tried to do was add scavengers, and scavenger is a compound that removes the active species. So for example, a scavenger like the hydrated electron scavenger of chloroacetate, and also the OH radicals scavenger like glycerol. So we take those and add those to the system and look at how it affects the mineralization of the parent compound. We find that liquid phase scavengers do not significantly affect the fluoride production in the system, which means that it's not stopping the reaction of the plasma. However, when we add a gas phase scavenger, in this case, CO is a gas phase species into the system, CO is scavenging OH radicals in the gas phase, it does significantly affect. So what this means, though, is that our reactor is actually, even though the PFAS is at that interface between the gas and the liquid, it appears that the main role of the plasma is attacking from the gas side. And again, those are just preliminary work and indicating the mechanism of what's happening based upon the efficiency that we've found. So just to emphasize what we've done, we built this plasma reactor, we've studied it, we've characterized it in many ways to try to understand how it works. And we've applied it to several cases, particularly in terms of how it compares to other processes like other advanced oxidation methods in terms of yield of OH radical. And we've also looked at how it compares in terms of yield of the hydrated electron. And finally, we looked at how PFOA itself has degraded. So I will say that we are, as I did mention, we are working with commercial companies to try to scale up our reactor. These are just a couple of versions of different plasma reactors we've worked with over the years. These are not exactly the ones we're commercializing because that's still a little bit proprietary, but we're working more on this level of the nanosecond pulsar in these parallel plasma reactors. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and certainly, I guess since this is online, I may not be able to answer questions.
Yeah, no, that's okay. What we'll end up doing, Dr. Locke, is as we release this video, I'll have people contact you directly should they have questions.
Okay.
Very interesting. Just out of curiosity, how far off do you think you are at this point to commercialization with some of the reactors?
Well, that's a good question. Hard to answer, but the first target of our commercialization is the topic I didn't cover here, which is really to take air and water and make nitrogen species like nitrates, and that to use that as a fertilizer. And we have a company. We've actually built a device that's almost ready for field testing, and we have company sponsors. The difficult component is the power supply, which we're still fine tuning. It's taken a longer to get the power supply fine tuned because we're really making our own rather than using a commercial one. And so we're hoping to be close enough that in that application within this year we can be moving along. The difficulty is what we don't know for the PFAS side is how well that same design or what modifications that design we make, because that reactor was designed for that agricultural use. And it's going to require some redesign for a PFAS water treatment process. So it's not yet known, based upon our experimental results that we're just starting to get now, how much redesign we would need to tune that reactor to make it suitable for the PFAS. So particularly things like frequency and the power supply characteristics could be different. So that's what we're studying now in terms of our laboratory and our collaboration with Geosyntec.
All right, one more question for you, just out of curiosity. Is there any applicability to the treatment of phosphate and nitrates using this technology? We had the huge release down in the Tampa Bay area. Just curious whether this type of technology could be used to help remediate those compounds.
It's a good question. I probably don't have an answer for you. We haven't tried anything like that. Although in our case of nitrate, it's still more of an oxidation process, even though we showed there is some reductive components. Primary process is oxidation, so it's hard to treat nitrates by oxidation. You need to reduce them, unless there was some other pathway. But it would be hard to go in that pathway of oxidation. So it seems for nitrogen and phosphate and nitrate, you want to have a reductive pathway. And even though we do have some reductive pathway, the predominance is more oxidation.
Okay.
So it might take a little bit of study to see if there's a way to do that.
Sounds like maybe something for the Hinckley Center.
Yeah.
To pass on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful, sir. Well, I appreciate your time today. We'll make this available to the folks that are following what's going on in the world of PFAS and PFOA. So thank you, sir.